Today we're going to continue with our series on hope for restoration as we go through the book of Ruth. And last week we were introduced to Naomi, one of the characters of this book, as we read through chapter 1, verses 1 through to 5. And as you read through those verses, you see this tragic story of this woman's life that is seemingly falling apart. And through this pain and this tragedy that she's experiencing, she believes that God in some way is punishing her or rejecting her. But as we go through the book of Ruth, we find that actually what God is doing is He's taking her circumstances and the pain and the suffering that she's gone through, along with the faithfulness, the obedience, and the love of people like Ruth and Boaz, and He's working together this incredibly beautiful story of restoration, which doesn't only restore Naomi's life, but impacts Israel and impacts the world. And with that, introduces one of the big themes that flows through the book of Ruth, that of God's providential work. Even when we don't feel like it, even when we can't see it, God is working for our good and for His glory. But today we're going to look at a second character, Ruth, the character from which the book is named. In fact, there are only 2 books in the Bible which are named after a woman, and Ruth is one of them. And the thing I want to pick up on particularly today is the fact that Ruth is a Moabite woman, which becomes very clear very early on in verse 4. The fact that she's a Moabite woman makes her an unusual choice on one level to be at the center of the story about God's great restoration. But at the same time, it's a significant point because it highlights something about restoration which is so important to us now in light of so many conversations that are on the news and on social media. So let's start with the fact that she is a Moabite. So Ruth goes to the land of Israel and she's a foreigner. She's going to speak different, she might act different, and it'll be clear to everybody in that nation that she's not from around here. And the only relationship she has is with a widow who's going through a dark night of the soul. And I can only imagine how, in some ways, vulnerable she must have felt, maybe even lonely in those circumstances. But she's not just a foreigner, she's a Moabite who is seen as a traditional enemy to the nation of Israel. And you just have to read through the Old Testament to see that there's quite a bit of history between these 2 nations. Now, it wasn't strictly prohibited for a man from the nation of Israel to marry a Moabite woman, but it was strongly discouraged because they worshipped other gods. And so not just a foreigner, but seen as a bit of an enemy, and certainly not seen as somebody who shares in God's promise and inheritance to the nation of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, it says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord." Talk about an exclusion. But God's great plan for His creation is about far more than just one nation. It has always been God's intention to reconcile and gather the nations to Himself. That the nations, regardless of tribe and tongue, would come to Him and know the dignity that He bestows upon them, the love that He has for them, and that they would understand that they are part of His great plan for all of creation. Now, the nation of Israel was raised up by God to be this beacon of light to the world, that the other tribes would see what God is like and how good He is, and that they would rush to Him. But Israel fails in that regard. But the Old Testament is still full, or not full, but has a number of pictures, whether it's through the prophetic words, some prophetic words that are shared, and stories which point to God's great plan for humanity, which is ultimately fulfilled in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The book of Ruth is one of those stories from the Old Testament which tells us about God's intention for humanity. So when we see that a Moabite woman is included in the story, pretty near the center of it, we mustn't just see that as an oddity or that's just a strange exception, even though it is unusual. Rather, we should see it as a signpost telling us something more about God's intention for the nations of the world. In Psalm 2 verse 8, it says, God says, ask me and I will make the nations your inheritance. So here we have this Moabite foreigner being weaved into God's redemption plan. The second thing, quite obviously, is that Ruth is a woman. And last year, as I was doing my reading through the Bible, one of the things that impacted me the most was just the contrast between what we see in the book of Judges and what we see in the book of Ruth. As I said last week, the book of Judges is an incredibly depressing book, and those last 3 chapters are particularly bad. In those last 3 chapters, we see the treatment of women, which is just appalling. A woman is abused and killed. We see women treated as possessions and abducted and taken into forced marriages where their value is seen as based on the children that they produce. And in no place in the book of Judges are any of these women named. And when I got to the end of the book of Judges, it was almost like I was grieving and thinking, how ridiculously far have the nation of Israel fallen from God's intention for humanity. And that contrast affords us the opportunity to reflect on this. And when we go back to the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, we see what God's intention is. And I just want to read that and just make 2 points in that regard. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28 says, Then God said, Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And the first thing just to mention there is something which should completely transform the way that we see ourselves and we see one another, is that we are made in the image of God. And that very statement means that humanity, from every tribe, tongue, and nation, men and women, have been marked with royalty and a dignity which is a pure act of grace from God. The uncreated creator of everything has placed his image upon us. And we see something of this amazement at God's grace of placing his image on us reflected in Psalm chapter 8. Psalm 8. And we see that this act of grace should transform the way we see one another, that we should act in a way of love and dignity as a result of this. The second thing I wanted to pick up on is that it says here that God blesses them, man and woman, and he commands them to rule over creation. This is not about man ruling over creation, but the picture is that man and woman together have been given authority to work in relationship over God's creation. I think it is hugely significant that at the end of chapter 1 of Genesis, the first part of the creation narrative, it finishes with man and woman together. And then at the end of chapter 2, we see man and woman together with this authority. And then we get to the fall in chapter 3, this devastating chapter where everything goes wrong. And I really am rushing through these 3 chapters which have so much to say. But I want to pick up on one particular verse which highlights or reflects one of the consequences of sin, of man's sin. And it is Genesis chapter 3 verse 16, where it says, Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now there is much that has been said and many different interpretations about exactly what that could mean. But without going into all of those details, I think all of us can agree, just by a simple face value reading of that one of the results of the fall is that the relationship and God's intentions for the harmonious relationship between men and women has been broken and fractured as a result of man's sin. In fact, it's not just the relationship between men and women, but all our relationships have in some way been impacted by the fracture caused by sin entering the world. That doesn't mean there's nothing good in our relationships. It most certainly is. But every single one of us carries with us something of that brokenness. But then we get to the book of Ruth. And what a relief. Even though Ruth does have its own cultural context, which is very different to our cultural context, here we have the woman named. We are invited into their story. And they become heroes and main players in this picture of redemption. We see in this book of Ruth a redemptive picture of woman. It's almost like we can sigh, we can gasp with relief and say, thank goodness that the book of Judges is not the final word, but there is another picture, a picture which restores dignity and honor to woman. And it speaks in the book of Ruth as well that we have value as a human being, no matter who we are. And God invites all of us to be included in his story. I think one of the things which is evident as you read through the Old Testament and as you read through the Bible is that we as humanity are lost and broken and in desperate need of a Savior. And thank goodness God expresses and demonstrates his love to us through the death and the resurrection of Jesus, so that not only do we find redemption for us as an individual, but we find that God is working redemption into all of his creation, restoring his fractured world and restoring the way that we do humanity together. And we see something of this gospel story in this little book of Ruth that we've been reading through and are going through at the moment. The horror of Judges is replaced by a kindness and an honor and a faithfulness and a care and a love which demonstrates something of the gospel. The life of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz still exists in a world which contains cruelty and chaos, and yet we see something of the hope shining through in this book. And we see something of God's restoration story shining through the lives of a woman named Ruth and a man named Boaz. So how do we take this story, which speaks about a Moabite woman being included in the story of restoration? How do we take this and how does it impact us in our lives today? Well, at the moment, whether it's on the news or social media, there's been so many conversations around xenophobia or immigration and around racism and around the roles of men and women. And I think there are some things from this book of Ruth that we can take into that conversation. The first thing is that we as the church should be that picture of restoration, where all nations and tribes, where men and women are given dignity and honor and where they flourish. How we treat one another should be a picture to the world of God's intention for humanity. And when we do that, I think we are taking something of this story about a Moabite woman and making it real in our midst. The other thing I think is that we should respond with grief when we see xenophobia and racism and misogyny in the world around us. And thirdly, I think what we should do is we should speak out and we should defend those who are marginalized. Because when we do that, we are declaring that there is a better way, that God's intentions for humanity are greater than what we see around us in the world. May the Lord bless you and keep you, turn his face to shine upon you and give you peace.